And we saw the stereotype, which is an uncritical generalization about a group, and the various uses to which they can be put. And the defense against them, typically in Smith's rhetoric, is to ask the question, but is this true? And kind of a secondary question is, if it is true, or possibly true, is it relevant? Then we turn to innuendo, which is the tactic of saying something that entails or implies something negative. It can be used primarily to insult someone or something, but it can also be used to suggest something negative, classic things like dog whistling, for example. And then we turn to loaded questions, a question that contains one or more unwarranted assumptions. Sometimes it's used humorously, sometimes it's used rather than trying to get information, to convey information, and it's often used to lead people into answering something that traps them, like in interrogations, etc. And the defense against a loaded question is to essentially ask, if you're being asked the question, what am I committing to if I answer the question this way? And if if it does seem like a trap, one could simply say, I can't answer the question as phrased. Of course, that comes with the risk too, because if someone's pretty clever, they'll push that as well. Okay, so those are the ones we looked at last time. Now we'll head to our new rhetorical devices. Rhetorical devices 3. The first one here is horse laugh, ridicule, sarcasm. Essentially, the definition is this. It's when, in place of giving reasons or evidence, someone simply provides something humorous or fun. And the idea is to mock something, typically to make it seem bad or foolish. But of course, simply mocking something and making fun of it, however clever, doesn't prove or disprove anything. Now, there are various comedic techniques that can be used to do this. Examples, the simplest one is simply stating it and laughing at it. Another one is using various other techniques of humor, as we'll see in the near future, hyperbole, exaggeration, humorous graphics, etc. Good examples of these, of course, would be comedians, and more specifically, things like, ones that are involved in politics and today's events would be shows like The Daily Show, The Late Show, and various other similar types of shows where they present stuff but with the comedic commentary. Now, there can be cases, of course, where something is worthy of mockery, and that counts against it. So if you could show that something is absurd or silly or ridiculous or stupid and laughable, then you could reasonably conclude that it's a bad idea. But simply mocking something or making fun of it doesn't disprove things. Now, in politics, this is fairly bipartisan. For example, Donald Trump engages in a lot of ridicule and sarcasm, mocking people, imitating them, giving them stupid nicknames. But of course, that doesn't prove anything. But it can be quite effective, which is why he does it. And of course, on the Democrats, they'll also engage in this, like Nancy Pelosi, for example, will make fun of Donald Trump, and comedians who are often seen as leftists, make fun of everybody. Now, on the side of evil in terms of using this, humor, as we'll see, can be kind of a risky thing, because most people aren't as funny as they think they are, and it can have really disastrous consequences where people try to use it. In some cases, career-ending. There are cases of politicians who have tried to be funny or say something funny, and they end up just blowing up on them. And so it's one of those things to use with caution. So before using it, you want to ask yourself, how funny am I really, and will this work in this context? Will people see it as funny? Will it work? If it passes both of those tests, yes, you were funny, and 2, it will work in this context, then it can be quite effective. Then you'd want to mock the target, whatever way is most effective, and then see what result it has. Also, of course, you want to know your audience, because what some people find is funny, other people may find is really offensive and insulting. For example, when Donald Trump was mocking the reporter with the disability, some people found that hilarious. He's mocking the disabled. It's just hilarious. Or making fun of women, etc. Some people find that hilarious. Other people find that terribly offensive. And so you'd want to, when using your humor, make sure you target it accordingly. So on the side of evil, question 1, am I funny? 2, will this work here? 3, what is my audience? And then deploy the humor. On the defensive side, the thing to say is, sort of, this is funny, but is it true? And if it's true, if the claim there is actually true, is it actually relevant? So if someone makes fun of, say, the Democrats' green energy plan, and they say, oh, green energy, what are they going to do, get Green Lantern to do this? Ha, ha, ha. That's why he's comedy, because he's terrible at it. That, of course, would be making fun of it and mocking it, but it wouldn't prove or disprove anything. Something to do is like when somebody mocks somebody, then to say, well, does that prove anything? And the answer is typically no. So that's horse laugh, ridicule, sarcasm. Before proceeding to hyperbole, anything about sarcasm that needs more sar or chasm. Now, for good examples of this, again, I'd recommend professional comedians for stuff that's aimed at today's political and big issues, things like The Daily Show, The Late Show, Late Night, etc., and those professional comedians, because that's what they do professionally. Hyperbole. Hyperbole, to give the formal definition, is an extravagant overstatement. Now, a good question would be, at this point, isn't that just lying? Well, kinda yeah, kinda no. So, what would be the difference between hyperbole and just straight up lying? Well, on one hand, you might say there is none. If you're saying things that are untrue, intentionally, knowingly, that is lying. Whether, regardless of whether it's just an exaggeration or just made up out of nothing. But it does seem worth distinguishing it, because we don't want to call, clearly, not all lies are hyperbole. Some of them are just not true, they're not exaggerations. And all hyperboles are untrue, we might not want to condemn all of them as just being terrible lies. So, what's hyperbole relative to lying? Well, that's kind of the idea. One type of lie is just saying something that just, there's nothing there, it's just not true. So that wouldn't be hyperbole, that's just saying something untrue. So if someone claims that migrants are bringing measles to the US is going to kill us all, that would just be untrue. Or if someone said migrants never commit crimes, that would also be untrue. Those would just be lies. Now, hyperbole occurs when you get something true, but what is said significantly exaggerates it, either significantly increasing it or significantly decreasing it. So hyperbole is, there is something in there true, but it's pushed up, to 11 or pushed way down, sort of, as kind of upplayed or downplayed. Now, so in that case, something there is kind of true. To give an example, one way is to do with just, blowing up numbers. So if someone says, there are 21 million illegal migrants in the US, and that'd be hyperbole because the actual number is probably around 11. Or someone says, hundreds of thousands of people die every day because of lack of health care. Well, there are people dying every day because of lack of health care, but not hundreds of thousands. And so those would be exaggerations. So kind of the defining hallmark of hyperbole is there's something in there probably true, but it's an exaggeration, not just made up of nothing. Now you can have lies that are also just extreme exaggerations. The kind of the strict use of hyperbole is the person is making an extravagant overstatement, and in general, there's something in there that's kind of true. But of course, we do see cases where something is extreme and entirely untrue, which would just be like a big lie. So, Other examples would be, well, advertising often includes examples of hyperbole, where they oversell like how dramatic or great the product is. Politics, of course, involves a great deal of hyperbole, talking about how terrible something is, greatly exaggerating it, or saying something's not as bad as people claim, sort of an extravagant understatement. So on the side of good, how do you defend against hyperbole? Well, again, kind of the standard defense against all of these is to always ask the question, but is this true? So if someone claims that, there are thousands and thousands of diseased immigrants rushing across the border to spread disease, the question asked is, well, is it actually true? And there are people coming across the border. Some of them probably have like the flu and stuff, but the hyperbole claim wouldn't be true. Or if someone says, hundreds of thousands of people die every day from lack of health care, well, again, you'd ask, is that true? And it's true that some people do die every day from lack of health care, but probably not like hundreds of thousands. And so the standard question, but is that true? Now, on the side of evil, here's how to use it. What you do is you would start off with something that is possibly true, and then just exaggerate it. Punching up the numbers, one easy way to do it. If it's, say, 10 cases, punch it up to hundreds or thousands. Or if it's a minor illnesses, relatively minor illnesses, punch it up to like the plague or something terrifying. And so the basic idea is just turn it up to 11. Now, to use this effectively, a couple of things to keep in mind. One is, of course, you don't want to go like too far, because at a certain point, it becomes just too ridiculous. So if someone said there are billions and billions of immigrants streaming across our borders with tanks and flamethrowers, that would just be seen as just no one would, well, I can't say no, someone would believe it, but it would just be too ridiculous. And so when you're exaggerating, you don't want to go too far. Now that depends on your audience, like how informed is your audience, and how much do they actually care about it being accurate. In some cases, you can push it to pretty ridiculous levels, and the audience will, even though they may know it's not really true, they'll still be moved by it. So, know your audience, always pretty critical. So you don't want to push it too far. Second thing to keep in mind is, you'd want to use it in a way that also sways your audience. So what is the exaggeration that would work with them? What is your target? So for example, if people are afraid of crime, which most people are, you'd want to exaggerate like the crime, the criminal aspects. Or on the other side, if you wanted to say cell migration, you would want to exaggerate the positive aspects. If having migrants improves the economy like a little bit, you want to say it has like an incredible, big, huge effect on the economy. And so depending on your audience, you'd want to expand, positive or negative. So kind of the key things are know your audience and know how far you can push it, because at a certain point it just becomes ridiculous. In terms of defending against it, the defense, as always, is to ask, but is that actually true? As they say, fact-checking it. Now, there are cases where hyperbole can occur, and there are cases that may look like hyperbole, but are not. Because some things are so extreme that extreme language is fit. So in the case of defining hyperbole, it's not just the language is extreme, it's that it's an extravagant overstatement. So if it's accurate, but extreme, need not be hyperbole. For example, the campfire, which always sounds like, whenever they say it on the radio, I always think of like campfire. It's something nice, then of course here it's like the whole state of California's on fire. If someone says that's like one of the worst, most terrible fire disasters in California history, that was devastating the communities, well, devastation, terrible, disaster, those are all extreme words. But in that case, it fits. There's billions of dollars potential damage, thousands of houses destroyed. And so saying that's, incredible damage and terrible would be accurate. Now, if someone describes, there being like an army marching towards the United States to invade us from Central America, that would be hyperbole. That there are people coming this way, but describing an invading army would be hyperbole. So not all extravagant language is necessarily hyperbole, because the extreme language could be accurate. So just because you see something like the greatest disaster ever, doesn't mean it's automatically hyperbole. The question would be, does it actually fit? And some things could be the greatest disaster ever. Now, there are many ways to do hyperbole. One way, as we saw, is you can use other rhetorical devices to make this work. You might use euphemisms to make things seem better, far better, but in all cases it involves this exaggeration. Now, one interesting effect of hyperbole is that psychologically, even if people don't believe the full hype, they can still be swayed and affected by it. It can still work. So, for example, to use an example from politics, Donald Trump uses a great deal of hyperbole. Self-admitted in his book, The Art of the Deal, or not his book, someone else wrote it, he put his name on it. He considers hyperbole to be he calls it, I think, like honest or truthful hyperbole. He uses it as suppose he uses it as a technique where he exaggerates things, the properties and values of things, and he uses that as a negotiating tool. He would say, this is worth, millions and millions of dollars, it's the greatest property ever. And the idea is, of course, as a negotiating tool, starting there is that the person suppose is going to push back. We always start off with kind of a haggling thing, like how great something is. Now, psychologically, of course, even if people know that it's hyperbole, it can still affect them. So, for example, when they advertise like a Truckosaurus as the greatest show in the universe, we know it's not the greatest show in the universe, but of course the hyperbole gets people kind of fired up. So even if the hype doesn't match the reality, it can still be effective. Also, like in politics, people can kind of know that it's not true, but it appeals to them emotionally. It kind of feels true. So when they've interviewed some supporters of various politicians, like supporters of Trump or other on the left as well, and they'll ask them, do you really believe that there are thousands, there are terrorists coming across the border? And some people will say, well, no, they don't really believe that, but they still support the idea of the wall, etc. And so someone may not actually believe the extreme claims, but it makes them feel a certain way. So it's sort of the feeling is true, although the facts are not true. And it's become kind of a standard feature in politics and advertising that in a way, if you don't do it, people kind of assume you're already inflating. So if you say something true, people automatically kind of push it down a few levels and kind of psychologically. So a very useful tool. Now we'll see much more of this in the 2020 election cycle when the candidates are slashing each other. We'll see them describing each other in very hyperbolic terms, like the worst person ever, the greatest liar of all times, all these terrible things. And it can be quite effective, because again, even if you don't believe the hype, the more you hear the extravagant overstatements, the more effective it is. So it's a pretty useful technique. Now it also, of course, can be used harmlessly for comedic purposes. There are comedic routines where people super exaggerate things, and people know it's super exaggerated, so it's funny. So that is our good friend hyperbole. Extravagant overstatement. The way to defend against it is ask, but is that really true? On the side of evil, again, know your audience, know how far you can push the levels of extremitude, and the defense is always to ask, but is that actually true? Fact checking. But as a sort of a final closing point, in many cases, psychologically, it doesn't matter if it's true. So, in politics, weird as it seems, people often don't really care if the exact numbers are true, it's kind of how they feel. So if people feel scared of migrants, and you say, well, there's not as many as they claim coming here, you know, it's thousands instead of millions, and they've got maybe like just the flu, some people have the flu and not like the plague, it won't matter. The people aren't gonna say, oh, it's fewer and they don't have the plague, oh yeah, let them in. They'll just, you know, either not be affected, or in many cases, you know, double down on it, just believe it even harder. So, hyperbole. Before pressing on, anything about hyperbole that needs more hyper or bole? Rhetorical devices 4, definitions and explanations. Now we saw back in the ancient days of the previous part, the rhetorical definition. And the idea is, the purpose of rhetorical definition is to define a term, but its objective is not so like you understand the meaning of the term, but so it either pushes people to feel good about it, or pushes them to feel bad. And this is an extremely useful technique, because if you control the emotional ladenness of the definitions in a debate, you're already kind of winning. It's, if someone accepts your definition, then there's a really good chance they'll accept your side. And if they accept the opposing definition, there's less chance they'll accept your side. So what you'll see in, obviously in academic debates, but also in political debates and other debates, people fighting over the definitions of the terms. Because if you can get your term defined the way you want it to, again, you're already kind of pre-winning. So, a good example would be in the, well, like with taxes. So if you define taxes as theft, well, and people buy that, you're already winning. Because if your argument is taxes are bad, and people accept, yeah, taxes are theft, you don't really have to push hard to get people to say, people stealing my stuff is bad, taxes are stealing my stuff, taxes are bad. Also, the debate over, well, affirmative action also is a battle about definitions. Because people who are for affirmative action, how do they define it? Or neutral. What is affirmative action supposed to do? Neutral.
That everyone, in particular, like school or I don't want to limit the business, but there should be diversity and inclusion across the board in like schools, jobs, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So kind of the neutral or positive definition is that the idea is that you should have more diversity, and you have active programs trying to encourage that. That there's sort of like well, it's like when you see job advertisements, because they used to just say job, and now every job now for decades says minorities and women encouraged to apply, because they show like, hey, we're not overtly racist or sexist here. Yeah, and so affirmative action in that case, the idea is to make up for past injustices. It used to be very unbalanced, and now it's just mostly unbalanced. And so that can be seen as, if you like affirmative action, you'd spin it positive. It's a system of bringing about, fairness and equality, making up for past injustice. But what about people who don't like it? Do they accept that definition?
No.
No, how do they define it?
They see it as a way to limit the number of qualified individuals to get in there.
Yeah. What are some of there's like some keywords people often use, the definition? Well, they often call it, reverse discrimination. Affirmative action is reverse discrimination, which is weird because reverse discrimination would be like being really non-discriminatory to people. So it's kind of because it assumes discrimination is against.
I see what you said with rhetorical definition.
Yeah. So that's a rhetorical definition too of reverse discrimination. Yeah. So if someone says affirmative action is reverse discrimination, we generally think discrimination is bad. And so people go into the debate thinking affirmative action, reverse discrimination, and you're arguing for it. Every time you say affirmative action, what they're hearing is discrimination, 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 and you're going to have a hard time arguing that discrimination is good. Yeah, because people are generally, don't like, especially when it's applied, when they think it's being applied to them. Or people call it like a quota system. And in general, that's seen as something bad. Like people are just getting getting the job or getting the, to the university, not because they earned it, but because of the quota. They just there to check, or some people call it, checking the box. They're just there, okay, we got one of each type, we're done. And so if you're debating affirmative action, depending how you define it, if you define it as a way of offsetting past injustices and bringing about more diversity, that's positive. It's easy to argue for. If it's defined as reverse discrimination, then it's harder to argue for. So when debating, one of the ways to sort of pre-win is to load the definitions. Get your definition out there first. And people who are clever and good at this make sure that they get that definition out there. To use an analogy, it's kind of like with legal cases. I get jury duty like all the time. I never actually served under jury duty, but I get, they have county, they have federal. Federal's better, because federal, you get paid. Last time it was like $44 a day, big money, easy money. Plus they have snacks, not great snacks, but at least they have snacks. County is terrible, you get like 0 pay and no snacks at all, which is sad. I think you get like $18 a day or something on county. It's like, what? I guess they haven't updated it since like 1804 or something, or maybe 1805. I use that's hyperbole. I'm exaggerating it. But one of the ways you win a trial is kind of like before you even go to trial, because if you've ever had the joy of being in jury duty, is you wait a long time, and then you go in, and the lawyers ask the two sets of lawyers with the judge presiding ask questions, and what they're trying to do is basically pre-win the trial, because they'll try to each side gets a certain number of people they can strike, and they usually use those on philosophy professors and lawyers, because if they ask me like, what do you do? I said, philosopher. I see both of them just kind of drew a big X. They both agreed that I should not be there. Or if you're a lawyer, they actually are too. And so if you pick the right jury, you have a much better chance of winning. Not guaranteed, the jury might still surprise the lawyers, but if you have wisely picked your jury, they're probably going to vote the way you want them to. Likewise, if you control the definitions, the debate will probably go the way you want it to go. Which is why you always see smart lawyers, smart politicians, smart business people always trying to grab the definition and control it. Because they're not doing it just to be jerks, but maybe they are, but they do it because they know if they control that definition, they control the battle. And this can be a big thing. For example, another example, if we look at something like religious freedom, what does that mean? Now, some people define it as that you're free to do your stuff with other people interfering. But then, on that definition, that would mean that, for example, if I was like religious and opposed to same-sex marriage, if someone comes to if I have like a philosophy shop and they want to buy some philosophy, then if I didn't agree with same-sex marriage and they wanted some of my philosophy for their marriage, I couldn't refuse them. But in my view, religious freedom means they can't stop me from being religious, they can't ban me from doing my religion, but I'm not free to like impose it on others. But another view of freedom of religion is that you have a right to, say, restrict services and hiring people and providing, contraception, through insurance. That religious freedom is you have a right to prevent other people from getting access to things. And depending on how you define that freedom, whether it's a liberty of you have to leave me alone, or I don't have to do anything for you because of I can impose on you because of my freedom, makes a huge difference. So at the start of the debate, if the person, say it's a court case, if the judge thinks religious freedom is people can't mess with you, then they would say, well, yeah, they can't come to your church and burn it down or scream at you when you're trying to pray, but you have to sell them a cake. That's just how it works. If someone takes the other view, that you can refuse people based on your faith, that's religious freedom, then the judge would rule you can refuse to bake them a cake. You can refuse to provide them with goods and services. You can refuse to hire them. And those are both different conceptions of freedom. And it'd be, if you control that definition, you kind of control the court case. And so it's a very useful way to win fights, which is why people get really hung up on language. And what's interesting is both sides do this, and one of their tactics is to accuse the other side of doing it. For example, well, there's a big fight, thanks to Gillette, over toxic masculinity. And people on the conservatives were arguing that the left is always trying to control the definitions, which is true, which is totally true. And then people on the left said, well, the people on the right are trying to do the same thing, which is also totally true. So in that battle, one of the sort of fights going on is the left points out, they say, well, it's toxic masculinity. And people on the right who are critical say they're being critical of all masculinity, that it's all toxic. In other words, they're attacking all men. And so the way they're trying to spin it is critics, conservative critics are saying the definition of toxic masculinity is basically, it means all men. They're going after your man, they're going after you. And of course, people who are trying to defend it say, well, no, it's not all masculinity. They say, because, toxic part. It's just like, if you're trying to get rid of, tainted spinach, you're not throwing away all spinach, you're just concerned about the spinach that's got, yuckiness, bacteria on it. And so, if you control, what the term means, if you can convince people that going after toxic masculinity means after all men, everyone's going to hate that. They're gonna. Anytime someone uses the term toxic masculinity, if a guy believes the definition, they're going to say, hey, you're attacking me. Not all men are bad. And if someone's on the left, and they think toxic masculinity is a particular type of bad masculinity, they would say, well, no, I'm just going after bad masculinity. And so a lot of the battles are over the terms. And you can see that people know this because they will accuse each other of trying to, control the language, which is what both sides are doing. I mean, it's kind of like at a football game, one side saying to the other one, you're just trying to control the ball. It's like, yeah, that's how the game is played. You control the ball. That's football. Same with politics. You try to control the football is the word. You try to control that word. So they're both right. All the sides are trying to control the words, but that is the game as it is played. So on the side of, I guess, evil, what you want to do is always try to control the language. You want to get your definitions out there, push them, get people to accept them. When people use the other side, you want to push against them, typically using other rhetorical devices to make them seem, terrible. And so, if you had a debate over toxic masculinity, if you were on the right, you'd want to push hard and accuse the person of saying, you're just attacking all men. And they say, well, no, we're not. And say, yes, you are. That's your shorthand for all men. And just keep pushing it till the audience accepts your definition. So, side of evil, push your loaded definition as hard as you can, and do as much damage to the side as possible. Now, on the side of good, you'd want to see, is the definition being pushed loaded, positive or negative? And to get to the actual truth, you'd want to push towards the middle. Like, let's come up with a neutral term for this. So, if we're having a debate over affirmative action, we want it to be an honest debate, we wouldn't use, the term, quotas or reverse discrimination, and we wouldn't use like an extremely good one, like a system of ultimate justice that is doing God's will, to be too silly. You'd push it to the neutral, like what it actually is. Or if we're having a debate over toxic masculinity or non-toxic, we'd want to push it not, towards like what do we mean by this term? Now, this is not to say, just as we saw before, there are some things that would be, even neutrally defined, would sound bad, like genocide. There's no happy definition of genocide. Making more room on the earth for everyone else, or whatever. And of course, there are some things that are just kind of positive, that, neutral definition would still be kind of positive, like, kindness or compassion.
I like the use kind. It kind of said genocide, because either way, those have such a stark definition that you can't take that.
Yeah, they're just sort of inherently good or bad. Because the thing itself is going to be, there's no like nice genocide. And there's generally no, even though they say you got to be cruel to be kind, there's no like bad kindness.
Well, with euthanasia, like you have to kill people to like help it stop suffering. Would that be like a bad form of kindness?
I guess you can make the argument. you could argue that the person is trying to be kind, because there is the argument that there is a paper in ethics where kindness is argued to be terrible. And not all of it, but they argue that kindness is actually small kindnesses and big evil circumstances are make it worse. And yeah, you could also take euthanasia where you're trying to be kind, but you could argue that it's, I'm killing you because I'm I'm so kind.
No,
Yeah, you could make that argument.
was it Kierkegaard that made that statement? The one you were talking about with the ethics?
This paper was by someone, I think they're still alive, so not Kierkegaard. But the existentialists do say a lot of stuff like, like if there's something like about suffering and how everything is like, life is meaningless and empty, probably an existentialist, probably someone like Kierkegaard or Sartre or one of those guys.
Is that what he was saying, like, a decision between either or is a moral decision because you have to make it, it's in a consideration either what's more positive or more bad. And so that's the only reason.
The assessment of positive and negative, that's usually like utilitarianism with, a lot of people say that, but most famously Jeremy Bentham, who's really dead, and John Stuart Mill, who came after Bentham and developed Bentham's theory into utilitarianism. And he's also dead. He died a while ago, 1800s.
Didn't he discover like the prison system, like the modern prison system?
Yeah, I think he was an influence on that. Yeah, I think Bentham. Yeah, I think he had the idea, if I recall. I think he had the idea of the panopticon. There was this idea that you would have a prison, and you would have a guard, sitting like in a central place, and it was arranged like a wheel, so they could see into all the cells. And so the prisoners, even if they're not being watched all the time, they would think they were being watched all the time. And he sort of created the idea of like perpetual surveillance. And he thought, wonder something kind of off the definition, but one of the things about the prison system was it originally was developed in the United States to be a system of penitence. The idea being, and it was developed by the Quakers of all people, the idea being that you would go into prison and you repent your crimes and you become a better person, because it was religiously based. The idea being that you would take people and redeem them. And they developed solitary confinement, but they realized that, but even back then they realized that just makes people insane. And they stopped doing it for about 100 years, but then they brought it back. So people knew solitary confinement was terrible century ago. It is crazy, because the original intent was, the intent behind our prison system originally was a positive one, taking people and repent their crimes. That's what they call it, penitentiary. And the idea would be is they would come back to society and be better people. But now it's basically just storing people and making money and making it worse. Yeah, you could also go in with like the definition of like prison or penitentiary. One view would be, well, it's a system of penitence. People are to be re-educated, returned to society. Or you could say it's a system of the prison industrial complex, where they exist solely, a system in which they exist solely to perpetuate a criminal underclass, to maintain political power, to make money. And that definition of prison would be one would be spun positive, one spun negative. Yeah, the system of punishment in America is a terrifying one, because it's weird. It's all because it's got this really kind of nice story, like with the Quakers and these philosophers saying we're gonna make make people better, and then turn into a nightmare. It's kind of like someone goes to, like a sci-fi story, someone goes to like cure people of disease and ends up just like giving everybody this, like turn them all into like monsters or something. Actually, it's kind of not far from the truth. Well, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And butter, of course. Rhetorical explanations. Now, neutrally, the goal of an explanation is to do what? If you're explaining, you're trying to
Get an understanding of the world.
yeah, so you succeed with a normal explanation if after you've done the explaining, the person's understanding, improves. They grasp, how or why or what you're talking about. Now, rhetorical explanations, their function is not to enhance our understanding. The idea, though, is that by giving the explanation, how or why it occurred, the idea is that it's supposed to make someone feel positive or negative. So they'll, so the goal is not comprehension so much is getting people to accept an explanation because it is positive or spun negative. So, more directly, rhetorical explanations are attempts to explain or account for something, but with the main goal of loading it positive or negative so that people accept that account as a positive or negative thing. Now, it's often used as a tool to, not surprisingly, to avoid blame or responsibility. So, if someone had an idea and it's rejected, they're probably not going to go and say, yeah, my plan was rejected because my idea was pretty stupid. They would probably say, well, my plan was rejected because it was too brilliant, too far, especially ahead of the times, and that the small minds of the people could not accept it. And that would be a rhetorical definition, because the goal is not so much to give an account of how and why it failed. It's basically designed, in that case, to make the person feel better and put a positive spin on it. As you might imagine, these explanations are very commonly used again when people are in trouble or do something that fails, and they're looking to account for it in a way that makes them look not so bad. You're kind of pushing the blame off on someone else. And so, be it in like everyday life or business or politics, it's a common tactic to push it off, spin it, positive for them, negative for the others. So it's essentially like saying, I'm not really responsible for this. It would have been great except for other people's faults. Now, in some cases, that actually could be true. So an explanation may seem to be purely rhetorical, but it may be accurate, because as you might imagine, the main defense is to ask, but is that accurate, is it true? A good example of this in recent history would be the government shutdown, because everyone knows, government shut down for like 31 days. And so, a lot of people are not getting paid, a lot of services not available, the parks were filling up, toilets were overflowing, and all kinds of bad stuff. Now, even though both parties, seem to want to use that as a political tool, it generally works out bad for everyone. And it works out worse for whoever gets the blame. So whoever, you can say, yep, they're the ones, everything would be going along, wasn't for those guys, they take more damage. And so when they shut down the government, it's a political tool. Basically, it's like taking a hostage. If we don't get what we want, we're going to hurt. We're going to hurt. Federal workers are going to hurt people. And so one side says, we're going to hurt people. The other side says, we're going to let you hurt them because we're not going to give in. And both sides, it's a scenario where it's not doing it is probably the worst, but refusing to give in also makes you look kind of bad, because you're saying, we're sticking with this, we're not giving in, even if it's hurting lots of people. And so the battle is basically over is who's going to get the...
So, in line with the example, but also considering how they use the government shutdown, I feel you mentioned before that the best, it's not the best, the using philosophy or logic is the best way to appeal to the people. But some things I feel just when you consider the information about it should be appalling. How powerful is this to where it's there are people that literally still willing to work, not getting paid, knowing that they still had to have another bill signed to allow them to get paid. I guess for me, it's just confusing. This is a strong tool, just because in that situation, people literally weren't getting paid, and we're yeah, no, we should have a government shutdown.
Well, the thought is that people use it, so they do think it's...
They know it's wrong?
Well, they know it, yeah, because no one comes up and says, no one runs for office saying, I'm going to shut the government. They say they're going to reduce it, but no one runs for office saying, I'm going to shut things down and not pay people. And during it, of course, they try to they do try to spin it, positive, but they do seem to think that it is a tool because people, they do it. Now, maybe they just, it may be, one explanation is one of those scenarios where no one wants to do it, but they just they kind of get caught in it, where it's, I don't know, kind of like in a bar where two people get in an argument, they don't really want to like stab each other, but it comes down to the stabbing or something. And so it's kind of a scenario where no one really wants to be the one to throw the lever to shut it down, but they kind of get pushed, they kind of trap themselves in that scenario. But some politicians do think, and Trump seems to think, and Pelosi kind of maneuvered him to saying that he was going to shut it down, and he thought it was going to be good. He thought his thought was he would win. And so an alternative explanation is that politicians go into it thinking that it will work. They'll shut it down, and they'll either get what they want, or the other side they'll get political points. And the other side may take the same view, that they're willing to let it shut down because they think they're going to get more points. So it's kind of a, so they both might see it as a useful technique because the points. So the next election cycle, will people say, damn those Republicans, I'm voting Democrat, or will they say, damn those Democrats, I'm voting Republican? But the battle, of course, to win that fight, you've got to explain it, so your side is positive, their side is negative. So the Republicans, their explanation was that the Democrats were shutting it down because the Democrats want open borders. They want America to be fenceless, and they don't care about the workers. So their Republican rhetorical explanation was Democrats are doing this because they don't want any border security, they want open borders, and they also said that it's a fallacy we'll see later, but they also said the Democrats used to vote for walls, but now they don't, so they're wrong now. Now the Democrats, of course, are trying to win that fight. They've got to give a rhetorical explanation that makes them look good, and the Republicans look terrible. So Pelosi and others said, well, we're for border security, but we're not going to waste money on a wall that doesn't work. And this is a Republican shutdown, and they can point to, Pelosi maneuvered Trump into saying that he's going to shut it down. It's going to be his shutdown. It's like right on the tape. And so the Democrats are trying to explain it as the Republicans are bad. They're just trying to score points. They're wrecking the country over this stupid wall that won't work. And the Republicans are trying to say the Democrats are terrible. They're trying to wreck the country because they don't want the wall that we absolutely need for security. And then kind of the battle is when people are watching this play out, which explanation do they swallow? And of course the risk is that people say both, as Shakespeare said, pox on both your houses, where people say they're both terrible. But then of course come election time, you gotta pick, it's Democrats or Republicans. So you gotta pick one or the other, so it's kind of like which one was less terrible. Yeah, and so the way they kind of, no one wins, but the way they kind of like lose less is getting their explanation bought by the public. So once the government reopens and the election cycle comes around again, what do people feel? Do they feel that the Democrats screwed them the most, or the Republicans? And it rests on the explanation that they can spin. Yeah, and so basically winning that, or losing less that fight is a rhetorical explanation. How, what is the other side doing? Now, of course, it's used all through any sort of propaganda wars. For example, let's take business. Facebook is always getting in trouble now because they do like terrible stuff. But of course, they have to explain what they're doing. For example, what are some sketchy things? Why has Facebook gotten in trouble recently? Or
because they're selling our data to different companies.
Yeah, companies like Cambridge Analytica and others, and letting Twitter and Facebook also do this because letting fake accounts or Russians, etc., put in fake stuff. Now, the question is like, why did that happen? Now, what Facebook has to do when Zuckerberg goes before Congress, he has to spin it so the explanation makes him look not terrible, because he doesn't want Facebook regulated, because the more regulations you get on something, the less they can do, and they think less money. So if you can't sell ads to Russian, Russian bots, you lose all that sweet, sweet Russian bot money. So his explanation was what? How did that data somehow get to these companies? Was it that Facebook is evil and they wanted to siphon up that money? No, it's not. What happened? Why were the Russians able to do all this sketchy stuff on Facebook?
He said because they just came in and did the same thing everyone else is doing.
Yeah, he said they were just naive. They just want to make the world a better place, and they didn't expect bad people to come in and do bad things. Yeah, so their explanation is basically they were naive, do-gooders, and these terrible, terrible companies just came in and did all this mean, mean stuff. And if only they'd known that people were bad, they were bad people, they would have done it better. That's kind of their story. Every time something terrible happens, usually their explanation is, we're just innocent do-gooders, we're just, techies, and these bad people just exploit things. We didn't know that bad people would do bad things. Now, of course, the alternative explanation is that they, which can also be rhetorical, is that these companies are terrible, and all they care about is money. That they don't care if the data they're selling hurts people. They don't care how the outcome, what it does to the democracy or countries or privacy. All they care about is the money coming in, and that would be a negative explanation of it. Now, in that battle over legislation and public opinion, same type of deal. You win it by getting your explanation to be bought, and you lose it by getting the other explanation. Now, of course, you can also use this in everyday life. We've all, done things. People say, "Well, why did you do that?" And of course, we try to, by human nature, we try to spin it so that we look positive. So, if somebody, like a classic example is laundry. Like if you're supposed to do the laundry and you don't, then you're like, oh crap, I'm supposed to do this laundry. Now, one way to do it would be, well, you can look quickly for an explanation. So why did I do this laundry? It wasn't because I was late, it wasn't because I was playing video games all day. You'd say, aha, I didn't know whether this clothing had to be like specially washed or repaired, and so I couldn't, I had to wait for, my partner, whoever to come back, because I didn't want to wash it wrong, because some of those clothes were super delicate. And so that'd be a rhetorical explanation. It wasn't that I forgot because I was playing, Fortnite all day. It was that I didn't want to risk harming those delicate clothes. Yeah, so we can use this in everyday life, just spinning a positive explanation. And so it's pretty useful to stay out of trouble sometimes. And I bet I've used this a lot myself. Oh crap. So on the side of evil, essentially what you want to do is this. Typically you've got something negative, something bad, and you want to spin it, positive. So what you do is you come up with an explanation, ask yourself, what would my audience buy? So you know your audience, and what would they regard as a positive account? What would they see as, what would make me look best? And of course, if you're doing the opposite, going after an explanation to harm someone else, you would say, what would my audience buy, and what would make my target look the worst? And of course, you can combine these. You can make, for example, if you're called someday you own like a internet mega company, and Congress is calling you in, you'd want to say what makes you look good, and the opposing thing look bad. And so that's kind of the main thing. Know your audience, know what they regard as positive or negative, and push that. The defense against it, of course, is to say, but is that true? So if you were like in Congress, in Zuckerberg, or you're listening to Zuckerberg, doing Zuckering, you would say, well, is that actually true? Is Mark Zuckerberg and all the people at Facebook, are they just innocents, no idea that people are bad? And you'd say, well, probably not, because another thing Zuckerberg says all the time is that he's the smartest person in the world, and he talks about how brilliant these people are. So it wasn't the case that people like Zuckerberg and Sandberg and Sheryl Sandberg and others, they just had no idea that people are bad and will exploit stuff, or were they just trying to make make money. And the more plausible explanation, we'll talk about plausibility and explanations in the future, would probably be the money thing. Because the idea that there's just naive and have no idea that bad people do bad stuff would seem to be less plausible. Now, of course, also the idea that they're supervillains who want to destroy the world, probably not true. Maybe. Yeah, so on the defensive side, you'd always want to say, but is this true? Okay, so that's our good friend rhetorical explanation. Before pressing on, anything about definitions or explanations? Or the Facebook that needs more stuff? Yeah, there's now yet another movement to move off Facebook to another social media. And I'm sure that the new social media will be great, because what could go wrong? Now, another useful rhetorical device is the rhetorical analogy. Now, an analogy is what? If you're making one, what do you do?
Comparison.
Yeah, you're comparing stuff. You're saying this is like this. Now, we do analogies for a variety of reasons. One is, and we'll see this in the future, is the explanatory analogy, where you say you got something someone doesn't understand, and you look for something similar they do understand, and say, well, the person understands this, this is like this, so then they'll hopefully understand that. So, for example, if you're trying to explain American football to a European who didn't really know how it worked, and you knew about rugby, you might say how it's like rugby, and how it's like rugby and kind of soccer. To try to explain it to them. We also use analogies in literature and aesthetics, similes and metaphors, where we say things like Juliet is the sun, arise, fair sun, and slay the envious moon. And we don't mean that Juliet is a ball of burning gas. We mean like Juliet's all pretty and stuff. And so those are comparisons done for aesthetic purposes. There also, we'll see in the future, the argument by analogy, where you say that because two things are alike in certain ways, they're alike in this other way. So, for example, one thing we'll see also in the future is animal testing. We test on animals, and the idea is we say, well, this causes cancer in rats, we're like rats, it will cause cancer in us, which would be an argument by analogy, which we'll see in the future. Now, there's also the rhetorical analogy. And the idea is that when you're making a rhetorical analogy, you're comparing two things, not to enhance understanding, not to make, well, it may also be to make a literary point, not to make an argument, but basically to say, essentially, you're doing this. Here's the thing you're talking about, here's what you're comparing it to. And you'd say, essentially what you're saying is, this is like this. This is good, this is good in a way. Or this is bad, therefore people are supposed to feel bad. So you're saying, you're basically comparing them, so the negativity or positivity kind of like smushes on the other one. Or to use, to use like a metaphor, it's like, well, you use an analogy of like two cigarettes, one's lit, one's unlit, and so you put them together so the other one is lit. Or if you have, like one cupcake that's unfrosted, one that's frosted, you kind of squish them together, now you have two badly frosted cupcakes. So the idea is that by sticking them together, you're contaminating them. Or you can also use like a disease theory. Someone's got a cold, someone else doesn't, just put them together, now they both got their cold. Now, as I noted, rhetorical analogies can be positive or negative. So you can make the comparison, make people feel good about it or bad about it. Now, as always, what counts as positive or negative depends on your audience. So a comparison that some people may say, is wonderful and great, others may see as terrible, and vice versa, depending on people's ideologies, values, history, etc. So when using this on the side of evil, essentially what you do is you have something, you want people to feel good or bad about it. So you find something that you know or believe they already feel good or bad about, and you smush them together. And you make that comparison. So you need to know what do they like and what do they dislike. And you want to be careful with that, because if you smush the wrong two things together, it can go badly. So if you think they really like something but they really hate it, then it goes badly. So what would be some examples? Well, common methods are this. We often compare people to people to do negative or positive. So for example, Republicans running for office always compare themselves to who? Which famous American president, governor, and movie actor? Yeah, Ronald Reagan. So it used to be that they all wanted to be like Ronald Reagan. And of course, Democrats generally wanted to be like
Kennedy.
Yeah, Kennedy. So if you were making like a speech to Democrats, you'd want to make yourself seem Kennedy-esque. Or Republicans, you want to make yourself seem Reagan-esque, because they're positive. And of course, one thing that happens is by now, a lot of Democrats still, now they kind of like Reagan because it's been so long and he's like really dead. And of course, Kennedy's been gone long enough that some Republicans don't, still kind of like him. So person-to-person comparisons. Probably the most common one is if you really want to make people feel bad about someone, you compare them to who? Who's the baddest person of all time?
Hitler.
Yeah, you just maybe say they're like Hitler. In fact, it's called the ad Hitlerian. You just say they're like Hitler, or like Nazis.
Oh, that's the thing.
Oh, that's the thing, yeah. There's I can't remember the name of the guy who did it, but there's a person who, he has like a theorem. I think it goes that if the conversation reaches the point where you're comparing your opponent to Hitler, the conversation is like officially done. Rationality has ended. Yeah, and so the idea is, he noticed that, and other people noticed it too, that quickly internet conversations would quickly go to Hitler comparisons. And at that point, it's done. Because, the Nazis and Hitler are pretty bad, but in many cases it's, going back to hyperbole, if someone is, they want to pass a law with having regulations on the environment, and someone says, that's just like the Nazis, what? Or, everyone's seen online debates where you can be talking about anime characters in a video game, and they're comparing someone to Hitler because they don't like the game, or they like the character. And so that point is just ridiculous. Now, in addition to like people comparisons, there are also people-animal comparisons. We use that quite a bit. We'll say, like, if we want to say someone's brave, we'll say they're like brave like a lion. Although lions aren't super brave. So brave things tend to die. Or if someone is like timid, we'd say they're timid like a mouse. Or fast, like the cheetah. We also compare people to things. We would say someone is as dumb as a rock. Yeah, dumb as a rock. And of course, we also compare things to things, and we compare ideas to things. Like we might say that idea is, that idea is as brilliant as an inflatable dartboard. And we compare also, countries to countries, history to history, and we can compare, anything, quite literally, plug in anything. So when doing this, you want to ask yourself, does this comparison work emotionally? Does it make sense? Or may not make sense, but does it work? And is it positive or negative? And it can be very effective. Again, if politics, advertising, or just general conversation, making a good analogy, rhetorical analogy, can be quite effective. If you get people to buy the comparison, if people say, hey, yeah, they're like Hitler, you've won. Or if you get someone to buy the comparison, if you're a Democrat running and you get people to think you're very Kennedy-esque, your chance of winning is better. Now this can often be combined, again with hyperbole, because if there's a debate about, whether, Dragon Ball or the original Dragon Ball Z is better, and someone defends Dragon Ball and someone else says you're just like Hitler, that's clearly hyperbole. Also, it often involves, the horse laugh, laughter, sarcasm, where people make these kind of like extreme mocking comparisons, often like between people and animals and absurd things. So on the side of evil, or that idea is basically, you want to make something seem good or bad, find something that is like it, or at least your audience will buy as being like it, that they would accept as positive or negative, make the comparison, and then see how the audience feels. And again, the critical part is knowing your audience. So if you're speaking to normal people, you would use a Hitler comparison to get a negative reaction. If you're speaking to neo-Nazis, you'd use a Hitler comparison to get a positive reaction. So one person's Hitler is another person's Hitler, I guess is the lesson there. On the side of good, the question to ask is there any there? Namely, is the comparison like a legitimate comparison? And you essentially be kind of saying, is there more to it than just smushing two things together and hoping people will feel good or bad? So you'd be kind of looking for, is there an actual argument by analogy? So if someone says someone's like Hitler and they're wrong, the question would be, are they right? Is the thing the person's doing really like Hitler? And if the answer is yeah, then probably bad. It's the bad stuff Hitler did. Because Hitler did like a lot of normal stuff, like eat breakfast and so on. Yeah, Hitler ate breakfast. So we don't want to say that just because someone eats breakfast, they are like Hitler because he ate breakfast. But we don't want to say that that's bad. So if someone is advocating, genocide of everyone else and white nationalism, then yeah, they would be rather like Hitler in ways that make them bad. So again, the defenses say, is that really true? Now, if all it is just a rhetorical comparison, again, logically it has no bite. If someone says, they're just like Hitler, okay, probably people are mad, but that doesn't prove anything. Before pressing on in our remaining time to misleading comparisons, anything about analogies that needs more stuff? Misleading comparisons. Now, as we go through life, we engage in making a lot of comparisons. An obvious example, of course, would be comparison shopping. If if your phone stops phoning as well as you'd like, you'd go and look to get a new one, and you'd probably go and compare stuff. And many sites allow you to check phones or computers or things and compare them. And Amazon, many of their products, you'll see like a display showing like the different products in that line, and then see like what at least according to the manufacturers, what they've got. When you pick a major, you presumably, possibly compare different majors to see which one to do. When you are applying for jobs and you get, say, multiple offers, you compare them to see which one to pick. And so we engage comparisons quite often. Now, to make good choices that involve comparisons, we have to know when the comparisons are good or when they're misleading. Now, there are a variety of ways comparisons can be misleading. In sort of general ways, one way takes us back to the ancient days of part one, namely comparisons that are ambiguous. Like if someone says, you'll have more fun in Arizona, or comparisons that are vague. Because in that case, if someone says, Arizona, you'll have more fun, the obvious question is, more fun than what? More fun than being in solitary confinement? Yeah, probably. More fun than being in another place? Maybe not. And so some comparisons are so vague, they don't really tell you anything. Another concern is, for misleading comparisons, not only can they be like vague and ambiguous, they can also leave, as we'll see, leave out critical stuff. There's also comparisons, a very popular one is the use of graphics. And if you're looking at information that's important, one thing you'd always want to see is like, what is the scale? So if there's a small difference between two things, you can make it look quite a bit bigger by drawing your graph a certain way. So suppose there's only 1% difference between these two things. Well, if you make the scale, 1%, make that like a huge amount on your graph, it looks visually, if you have no scale, this looks way bigger than this. But then if you put the scale on, like this is like a 1% difference, it doesn't look quite so big. So there's all kinds of ways comparisons can be misleading. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of the iceberg, to mix some metaphors. So when you're confronting comparisons that matter, like you're going to spend like a lot of money or make an important life choice or just don't want to be wrong, what are questions you should ask to try to avoid getting it wrong? Well, here are 4 useful questions. First one is this. Is there important information missing from the comparison? So, to use an example, suppose someone says that only 10% of child abuse cases involve alcoholics. Now, hearing that, a person may think, wow, if only 10% of child abuse cases involve alcoholics, then if I'm going to get a babysitter, I should probably get an alcoholic, because that means that 9% of the cases involve people who aren't alcoholics. So just on those numbers, it would seem that alcoholics would be a good choice. But we probably know intuitively that that's probably a bad idea, and the reason why is this. Just knowing that, say, 10% of alcoholics, 10% of child abuse is done by alcoholics, yeah, that means that 9% is done by people who aren't, but for that to know to know this comparison, or to know what is meaningful in this comparison, you'd have to know the percentage of people who are alcoholic. So if 3% of people are alcoholic, but they account for 10% of the child abuse, that would mean that they disproportionately abuse. You know, it's like 3.3 times the number. So in that case, even though they account for less, it's a small percentage of the population that's doing, you know, way out of proportion. And so, as you would imagine, knowing that fact, you know, reveals what you suspect. People who are alcoholics are more likely. So you wouldn't hire the alcoholic to be the babysitter. Yeah, so you need, if you have comparisons like this, you need to know kind of like the other facts about it. So whenever they say like X percentage of crimes are done by, you know, certain number of people, certain type of person, you need to know, okay, what is the percentage in the population? Are they doing at a higher level or a lower level? So if they said, you know, 1% of the crimes in America are done by migrants, just to make up a number, you might say, wow, that's terrible. You know, that's a lot. That's, you know, 1%. It's quite a bit of crime. But if you find out that migrants are like 5% of the population, then you'd be like, well, yeah, they're doing some crime, but they're way underrepresented in doing the crimes. So yeah, just knowing just the first number, 1% of crimes are done by whoever, you would need to know the base percentage. Now, if it turned out that 1% of the crimes is being done by 0.01% of the population, yeah, you'd be worried about that part of the population because they're doing a lot of crime relative to their lives. Okay, so have a good rest of the week. And on the Tuesday, we'll talk more about misleading comparisons.